Hey, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Annie Gaus here, senior editor at the San Francisco Standard. We have a special guest today, Congressman Ro Khanna, representing the heart of Silicon Valley. We have a lot to talk about. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to our audience. We will be taking some questions as part of this conversation. So if you do have burning questions for the Congressman, drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. So Congressman, I want to start by just getting your diagnosis of the election results last week, which I think was seen by a lot of people as a pretty decisive rejection of not just Vice President Harris, but of Democrats across the country and across demographic groups. And I want to know, how you interpret these results and what they mean and what they say about the country.
Well, it was clearly a loss, and a loss that was more depressing than some of us imagined. I mean, we lost all 7 battleground states. We have a very uphill climb to get the House. Doesn't look likely. But I don't want to exaggerate it. I mean, if 2% had gone differently around the country, we would have won. And so it puts us in a good position if we engage in introspection and listening to come back in 2026 and 2028. Remember, our chances of coming back today are much better than Donald Trump's chances were of coming back after January 6th. So people shouldn't give in to defeatism.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of conversations are taking place in the Democratic Party in terms of how to move forward from here? And, there seems to be kind of a debate happening where there's a camp that believes the party needs to go further, further embrace more progressive ideas. There's a camp that seems to think that the party needs to pivot to the middle a little bit. Where do you sit on these discussions? And, what kinds of conversations are you seeing on how to reset the message?
That's an old frame, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how are we going to address the legitimate anger and fear and frustration of many Americans, working class and others, who are economically struggling and who feel that the political and economic system has been rigged in a way that just isn't working for them? They see wealth piling up in a district like mine. They've seen their jobs and plants close and be offshored. They've seen wealth inequality rise. They see the costs of childcare and housing and college and apprenticeships get out of reach. And they want to know, what are we going to do to make it so that their kids can have a better life than they did? And so there may be different solutions to how we do that. And we need to engage our broad party. But that narrative needs to start with acknowledging the legitimate anger and frustration of so many Americans.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are those who would argue that under the Biden administration, the economic policies were relatively progressive. We saw a historic infrastructure bill and things like the CHIPS Act would seek to revive manufacturing in the USA, child tax credits. In your view, is it that the policies weren't right or didn't go far enough, or that we in the Democratic Party don't have the right messengers to get that message to the people that they need to reach?
Well, I don't think we told the story enough vividly, concretely about how people really had been shafted by both parties for 50 years, how wealth has accumulated, how we've gone in income inequality from 53rd in the world to 128th. And say, look, all these corporations that ship jobs overseas, we're changing that. We have the Chips and Science Act that I co-wrote to build semiconductors, but understand that this is not going to be overnight because it took 50 years to destroy a lot of the working and middle class. And we're trying to get childcare done, to get healthcare done, but this is going to be a long fight. So we needed to talk more clearly about the economy every day. I don't think that was the emphasis about the restoration of the American dream for people who haven't had it. And we needed to go much more to small towns. I've been for 8 years, if you Google, going to places like Paintsville and Johnstown and Milwaukee and Ashtabula County in Ohio, and trying to understand what the anger, the frustration is there, listening to people. We need to do a lot more of that as a party, and making sure that our policies, our legislative policies, are actually targeting those communities. Because a lot of it went to places like Columbus, but didn't actually go to the small towns that were hollowed out. One statistic for you, 85% of venture capital, 85% are in the states that Harris won. Only 15% of venture capital are in the states that that Donald Trump won. That's from Steve Case, who started Rise for the Rest. That should be a wake-up call for us.
Hmm. Now, you were in office during Trump's first term, and having observed that play out, what are your broad expectations for, say, the first 100 days under the next Trump term? What do you think the priorities will be?
Well, it's so unpredictable. I mean, I am fearful that they're going to start to gut important agencies like education, and I'm concerned about what that's going to mean for our kids and our school districts. In my district of Title I, I'm concerned about that they're going to try to repeal parts of the Inflation Reduction Act and just go carte blanche on drilling. I'm concerned about what they're going to do on Middle East policy. I mean, the people that they've appointed. Like Governor Huckabee and Representative Stefanik. I mean, are they going to allow Netanyahu to annex the West Bank like they did in a previous administration where Netanyahu annexed Golan Heights? I mean, is there going to be any commitment to a two-state solution? I am concerned about what the president's going to do in doubling down on tax cuts for the very, very wealthy instead of building manufacturing and investment here.
Mm-hmm. We've heard in particular a lot of concern about the immigration agenda that Trump has articulated. In fact, we did a story the other day about people in San Francisco who are very worried about what the second Trump term will mean for their futures. And that's something that, he's talked about mass deportations, and that's something, if enacted, would obviously have huge implications for California. But then there's also, there's some realistic barriers to actually executing something like that operationally and fiscally, and pushback from industry. But how worried should people be about the immigration agenda that Trump has articulated in California?
They should be worried because it's one thing to figure out how we work towards securing our border, or making sure that people with violent crimes aren't coming across or aren't staying in the United States. I think most people with common sense want us to have secure borders, and as a son of immigrants, want us to make sure that the immigrant community, if there are immigrants who are violent felons, that they're not here. But that's not what Donald Trump is talking about. And as you know, immigrants commit less crime, just statistically, than people who are like me, who are born in the United States. That's just the data. But what Donald Trump is talking about is going to employers, going into San Francisco Chronicle's newsroom, going into different workplaces, and having mass raids and checking people's immigration status, even if they've been here 20, 25 years, paying taxes, hardworking in communities, and having mass deportation. And I think that the image of that is going to be too much for many Americans, and we need to make sure that we're vigilant and standing up for fairness. Most Americans want secure borders, but a humane policy.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the Trump agenda and how it may affect the Bay Area specifically, what concerns you most?
The funding. Are we going to continue to get the funding that for transportation that the Bay Area needs? The funding for clean technology that much of it's coming to the Bay Area and other places. The CHIPS and Science Act. We have a national semiconductor center that's supposed to come to my district in Sunnyvale. Are we going to keep getting that funding? One of the challenges we have with Speaker Pelosi no longer there, she was the most effective person for California in the last 40 years in terms of the amount of resources that she brought to the state. No one even comes close to her level of skill and leadership. And not having her there, what is California? How are we going to step up to make sure that we get our fair share of resources, especially in a Trump administration?
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to turn to a listener question here from Jay. How do you explain President Biden's failure to stop the war in Gaza? And going forward, how do you think the Democratic Party should, in terms of that issue and in terms of AIPAC?
You cut out a little bit. I think the question was, what do I make about the failure to stop the war in Gaza? Is that correct?
Yes.
Look, I think the policy has been a mistake. I mean, I was for Israel getting those who perpetrated the awful October 7th violence. And I'm glad that they got people like Sinwar and Nasrallah, who in Lebanon, who have murdered Americans and obviously engaged in terrorism. But the way Netanyahu has prosecuted this war for over a year, with the bombings that have killed over 40,000 people in Gaza, many civilians, has been really taken a civilian toll. And so my view is that we shouldn't have given him the blank check. We need to figure out how we can get the release of the hostages, but also a permanent ceasefire, and then work towards a two-state solution, which doesn't have Hamas governing Gaza, but new Palestinian voices in conjunction with the Arab League. Now, I don't think that that's where we're going to go with Donald Trump, given these recent appointments. I mean, these are pretty right-wing appointments, or basically, in my view, going to give a carte blanche or green light to Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the role of House Democrats over the next couple of years that are, going to be in the minority? And are there areas you think you can make progress despite the fact that we'll have 2 years of a Republican monopoly on Congress and the presidency?
The most important thing we could do right now is to take a deep breath, listen, go around the country, talk to voters in our own districts, around California and around the country who didn't vote for us, and to say, what are you thinking? Where can we do better? What was the disconnect? What do you want to see done? And spend 6 months going through some introspection in terms of what we can build for the future. The second thing we need to be doing is offering a bold agenda of how we can help renew the American dream for the vast majority of Americans who feel that they're struggling economically and their kids aren't going to be able to buy a house or buy a car and don't have a better life than they did. And we need to be the party that says we understand the modern economy, we understand AI and technology, and we're going to use this, leverage this to bring new factories to your communities, to build new wealth generation opportunities, to help workers get higher wages, to create incredible new apprenticeships for people to have economic success in a modern economy. So the economy works not just for the techies in Silicon Valley, but for everyone in America. And the third and equally important part is that we have to be vigilant for Donald Trump's overreach. And when he is doing something like raiding employers indiscriminately, or when he is gutting environmental legislation or gutting the Department of Education, we need to speak out for our values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are conversations happening within California right now with Governor Newsom, and the legislature is convening a special session in December to kind of discuss how to steel the state against a second Trump administration. What's your view on that? How can California best prepare or position itself for the ramifications of a second Trump term?
Well, the governor is coming to meet with the congressional delegation on Wednesday. I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts on what he thinks our vulnerabilities are. I assume we need to be prepared in case there is a natural disaster, that we're getting the funding from FEMA. We need to make sure that we're getting the resources to be able to build more housing. I know the governor cares about building more housing units, and that we're qualifying for the low-income housing tax credit and getting resources that we need, that we're getting the infrastructure resources, that we are still setting the stage and leading on climate, even if Donald Trump is moving backwards, that we have a robust presence at COP39 and other places. But I'm looking forward to hearing the governor's thoughts, and as a California delegation, seeing what we can do to make sure that Californians' interests and values are protected.
Mm-hmm. What are your expectations as far as how the Trump administration will work with Silicon Valley? He had some high-profile people like Elon Musk around him in the campaign. How do you think those relationships might affect how the federal government works with, some of the companies in your own district?
Well, it remains to be seen. I'm hoping Elon can talk him into recognizing climate science and recognizing the value of electric vehicles and battery plants and storage, and just following basic basic science. But what would be unfortunate is if people start to dismantle agencies, if jobs are lost, if there's some push for massive deregulation. Look, you need sensible regulation on, for example, AI. You just had a case where someone asked a AI chatbot about what they should do, and the chatbot recommended suicide, and this young man took his life. I mean, we need regulations to prevent that. We need regulations to make sure AI doesn't replicate the worst parts of social media and doesn't become a threat. And we need thoughtful legislation on that. And I hope that we can work towards that in a bipartisan way.
I mean, I was going to ask, is the hope for AI regulation kind of tabled for now with Trump's election, or do you think that there's a path forward for some bipartisan consensus?
There has to be. I mean, we need to figure out, for example, copyright material like San Francisco Standard. This interview, it can't just be loaded up into AI, large language models, and no compensation to publishers, to writers, to artists. There has to be thought about what is fair use of copyright and where there should be licensing agreements. That there needs to be thoughts on what are basic safety regulations for AI models. There needs to be thought about how do we credential people for the jobs that so that AI empowers them instead of displacing them. These should not be partisan issues, and it would be a real tragedy if Trump takes the view, I just want deregulation and no regulation on AI, and that is setting us up for both the degradation and destruction in certain cases of the publishing industry, newspapers, and content creators, and also putting us at safety risk.
Mm-hmm. Um, what about this talk of tariffs, that Trump has discussed? You also sit on a subcommittee that deals with our relationship with China. How do you expect to see the tariffs that he has talked about actually take effect, or is somebody going to rein him in on that?
I'm on, as you put it, the committee for the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. We need certain strategic tariffs. I mean, I mean, trade has been totally unbalanced in this country. NAFTA was a mistake that led to the hollowing out of a lot of our manufacturing. Getting China into the World Trade Organization the way we did was a mistake. We can't have China dumping steel, dumping electric vehicles into the U.S. But we need these tariffs to be strategic, to be targeted, to be coupled with investment in industry here so we can build these factories here so that we can build our workforce here. And we can't just have blanket tariffs that then drive up the price of consumer goods. So my view is let's do it in a strategic way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another reader question, or listener question. Please keep them coming. This one is from David, who wants to know, will a Trump administration expand the Supreme Court, or otherwise, what do you expect to see in terms of Supreme Court movement?
I don't think Trump administration would expand the court, but he could, of course, appoint new justices. This is a good time, in my view, to do my bill, which is every president gets 2 appointments. I don't think Trump's going to get more than 2. And justices are term limited for 18 years. And he should be for those term limits for Supreme Court justices. But I am concerned that he could further entrench the conservative nature of the court, even if he has conservative-leaning justices retire, and he could replace them with much younger justices.
Mm-hmm. There's been some talk of Justice Sotomayor stepping down. Do you have a view on that? Should she step down so Biden could make another appointment before he retires?
Oh, that's totally her decision, and she's. I don't even think she's 70, and if she's in good health and thinks she can serve, then that's totally her decision.
Yeah. What else? There's been some talk of gutting the CHIPS Act. Is that something that you think will happen?
It would be very short-sighted because I co-wrote the CHIPS and Science Act with Senator Schumer, Senator Todd Young, and talking about the competition with China. One of the biggest challenges is our dependency on Taiwan for semiconductors. This is a national security issue to make have the semiconductors made here. Anyone who remembers COVID, where you couldn't buy a car because the cars were sitting on these lots, vacant. And not being used, sitting on these lots because they didn't have semiconductor chips. We need these semiconductors here. And the person who actually started the chips idea was Keith Krach, who was in the Trump administration. So my strong view is that we need to continue it. If anything, we need to expand it to include legacy chips and other kinds of investment in chips. And I'm hopeful. I mean, the speaker had said he was going to repeal it and then backed away from it. I think when the Trump administration looks at it, they'll realize this is clearly in our national security interests.
Mm-hmm. There's also been some chatter about rolling back parts of the Affordable Care Act. Same question. Do you think that is realistic, and what are your expectations there?
I'm hopeful that Trump has learned his lesson from the first term. It was one of the worst things he did in terms of popularity. People want the Affordable Care Act. He said he wasn't going to repeal it this time around, and I think he realizes he doesn't want to have that fight again. He'll lose it, and it would hurt his popularity.
Mm-hmm. And in general, what do you think will be done differently under Trump 2.0, where he has already 4 years of experience being the president under his belt? He presumably knows how the levers of government work, maybe a little bit better than he did before. What do you think will be different about Trump's second term in terms of how he governs?
He's so unpredictable. Who knows? I mean, so far, the person he's appointed as chief of staff is at least competent. I mean, I don't agree with her, but she has a reputation for competence. I mean, the hope would be at least be more disciplined and not having policy made by tweets and foreign policy made by tweets and revolving door of people staying for 6 months and leaving. I don't wish that on him because I want, for the sake of our country, to the extent the presidency can succeed, I want it to succeed. I mean, I don't want him to implement the extreme versions of his agenda, but I have real fears. I mean, is he going to gut the Department of Education? Is he going to have mass raids of businesses? Is he going to gut climate provisions and clean air and clean water provisions at the EPA? And no one knows. I mean, we're going to get a sense in the first few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about things like, there's been rhetoric about eliminating the Department of Education, but like, what is that? How do you actually do that? What if any checks or roadblocks are there for a president who wants to gut entire departments or eliminate entire departments? How does that process actually work?
Well, they could have Congress zero it out in funding. I mean, obviously, if they control the House and the Senate, I don't think that enough senators or even House members would go along with it. But that's one way, or they could slash the budgets dramatically. And then you could have what Robert Kennedy has talked about. I mean, he's talked about firing people at the NIH, just letting go of folks. I mean, you could have people start being laid off and fired at the Department of Education. So technically, you still have the department, but it's being hollowed out. But why does this matter to people? Because a lot of folks go to schools that are Title I schools or schools that require federal funding. A lot of people have kids who have special needs and are in those programs. That gets federal funding. A lot of people like me took out loans to go to college. That requires federal funding. And so these are real things we're talking about. We're not talking about some abstract bureaucracy. I just hope that they don't do something extreme that they've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from RJ who wants to know, is California vulnerable to a loss of federal HUD funds that subsidize housing for the homeless and the formerly homeless? Obviously, a very salient issue in San Francisco.
Well, we just had discussed that earlier as a concern I raised. I mean, how do we make sure we're getting the low-income housing tax credit funds? How do we make sure we're getting appropriate HUD funding for building affordable housing and that California is not being shortchanged? And I look forward to discussing that with our California delegation and the governor. That's one way of making sure that California is not going to be hurt by Donald Trump. I mean, look, he should not single out any state, just like Joe Biden did not single out any red state just because they didn't vote for Joe Biden. He's the president of the entire country.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Are you in favor of an independent United Nations investigation into who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines?
I think the United States can conduct that investigation and has, but I would defer to our State Department.
Okay. Um, we have a question from Terry related to crypto. I guess the question generally is there's been some signals of crypto deregulation under Trump. What are your expectations there on the relationship between the Trump admin and the crypto industry?
Well, as a supporter of blockchain and as a supporter of crypto, I think what the community really wants is regulatory clarity. They don't want
Mhm.
deregulation. They want to know what the SEC should regulate, what the CFTC should regulate. Fit 21, a Republican led bill by Patrick McHenry, is a very thoughtful bill. I have a co sponsor on it. 79 Democrats voted for it. It passed the House. I hope in the lame duck we can get it to pass the Senate and the president can sign it, or that Donald Trump would support that. We also should be supporting stable coins and having some regulation so that stable coins can be used to transfer money overseas, and people are then engaging in transactions that are backed by the dollar. So there are some concrete steps that we can take that will make it possible for America to lead in this new financial innovation.
Mhm. And what about the antitrust environment? There were a lot of people in Silicon Valley who were not fans of Biden's FTC chair, and that is something that would seem to be likely to change pretty quickly. How will that affect Silicon Valley and some of the companies in your district?
Well, Lena Khan did a lot of good work to make sure that not just in the Valley overall, that we weren't having uncompetitive behaviors. And my view is that you have to have a nuanced view on antitrust, and that is make sure that companies aren't taking advantage of exclusive deals, make sure that companies aren't privileging their own products, but you also don't want sort of a blanket rule that you can't have mergers and acquisitions, even smaller ones, where that's the exit strategy for a lot of startups, or that you want to just break up these tech companies where some of them, like DeepMind at Google, are producing Nobel laureates. So I hope that we can have sensible antitrust enforcement, that we don't go to carte blanche where these companies can just do what they want and continue to engage in places in uncompetitive behavior, but that we also recognize the importance of some types of mergers and acquisitions and some kind, and the value that tech companies provide from a national security and economic perspective.
Hmm. And as we're seeing news start to trickle out about who Trump is appointing to certain key positions, what positions are you watching most closely, and as ones that would be likely to be most influential when he takes office?
I'm concerned about Department of Education, who he puts there. Is he going to just privatize that? I was very concerned about Tom Hahnemann getting appointed. Sorry if I butchered his last name, into this position of overseeing these raids that we've been talking about. I am concerned about the Department of Defense, who we end up there, and will that person really have a view of standing up for Ukraine, or are we going to cede Ukraine to Russia? So those are a few of the places.
Hmm. Um, it looks like the last I checked that Marco Rubio is likely to be the new Secretary of State. What's your take on that?
He's a very competent person. I don't agree with him in terms of all his ideology, and have a view of much more restraint, and we have a different view of the Middle East. But he's certainly competent and capable of doing the job from that perspective.
Okay. Um, and there's also been, throughout Trump's campaign, there was a lot of talk of retribution against his political foes. I think the DOJ appointment and what happens there will be very closely watched by people. What are you expecting to see there in terms of this, use of the DOJ in perhaps a way that is unconventional compared to past presidencies?
Well, I should have said I'm really concerned who the Attorney General is going to be, because my
Mhm.
hope is that the president will not politicize these investigations. Now, he's going to say, well, Democrats politicized investigations against him. I don't believe that's the case, but regardless of which way what your beliefs are, it's time for this country to move on. It's time for there to be healing. And the worst thing would be to have tit for tat, politically motivated investigations. The president gave mixed signals about this in the campaign. Sometimes he said, I'm ready to move on. Other times he said, no, I'm really going to go after people who came after me. My hope is that he's going to move on, but we have to be vigilant and engage in oversight from Congress to make sure those agencies aren't abusing people's rights.
Mm-hmm. Um, the midterms are 2 years away, and where, if looking into the future, where, what do you think in 2 years, people, if Democrats do what they need to do in terms of what you've spoken about and getting into communities and listening to people and trying to understand, the concerns that the American people have, do you will we see a reversal potentially in 2 years versus where we are now, where people might be more open to, a Democratic Congress?
I do think so. I'm confident we're going to win in 2026, usually, not just because the out party usually wins seats, but I think we're going to reflect, we're going to be ready, and we're going to be competitive in districts across this country. So we need to not give in to defeatism. Again, I go back to that simple point. Our comeback is much easier than Donald Trump's comeback was after January 6th.
And there's also some conversations happening about who are the new party standard bearers at this point. Who are some of some of your colleagues, or people in the party that you think might be relevant or important in all these conversations moving forward?
Well, we've got a great group of new leaders that are emerging. I mean, obviously there's Hakeem Jeffries, who's our leader in the House. There's Pramila Jayapal and Greg Kazar are leaders in the Progressive Caucus. Then we've got great governors, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, obviously California's own governor, Gavin Newsom, is going to be part of these conversations, Wes Moore, and I'm sure there are a lot of other names, that Pete Buttigieg, that I'm leaving out, but I think we have a very talented, deep bench of people who are ready to step up for the next generation of leadership.
Mm-hmm. And for you personally, what are going to be other than the listening and traveling the country and hearing people's concerns, what are your personal legislative priorities starting next year?
Well, housing in my district, that's the biggest issue, that people can't afford to live in parts of my district. Rents are too high. It's one of the reasons I was proud to co-chair the Renters for Justice proposition. Unfortunately, it didn't pass, which would allow cities to cap the rent. But I'm going to continue to work to get resources for affordable housing in my district, to support people who want to build more affordable housing, to support the capping of rents and helping people with their rents. Nationally, I am really committed to figuring out how we have an economic revitalization agenda geared towards communities left out, the modern prosperity, and also towards middle class and working class families getting the support they need on childcare, on healthcare, on education. And I'll work with Republicans if I think that we can advance the ball in providing that help for people who are struggling.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about families, what does that support? What does that support look like?
Well, I've called for childcare at $10 a day, like they have in Canada, with childcare workers being paid $20, $25. Now, it would cost money, and it would be an investment of 70, 80 billion a year, but I think the country can afford it and should do it. I believe we need to have free public college. I believe we need to have Medicare expanded to Medicare for all, so that people's premiums go down and out-of-pocket costs go down. Now, I recognize a lot of this is probably not going to happen in a Trump administration, but I will say Tim Ryan and I had called for $2,000 stimulus checks. That was actually an Andrew Yang idea, and Donald Trump signed it. Not only did he sign it, it was one of his most popular initiatives that may have helped him win election this time. So if there are opportunities to work on things that are going to help the American people, that are going to help the working middle class in this country, I will do it. But you need a partner. The White House has to be willing to do it.
Mhm. Um, I have another question here from Jay. What are your thoughts on how to reconcile the increasing threat of climate change and insurance companies denying coverage? Obviously, been a huge issue in California.
Well, it's a tremendous issue. It's why we need some federal solution. I mean, we need to obviously tackle climate change, and we can go into what we need to do on solar and wind and geothermal and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. But we need some federal insurance system that is going to help insure places that are most at threat under climate.
Mm-hmm. And how do you've mentioned a couple times in this conversation concerns about rolling back progress on clean energy and in the environment under a Trump administration. How do we hedge against that in California?
Well, we need to show that we're still leading. America, obviously, the president matters, Congress matters, but America is bigger than any individual or even than our current elected officials. There are a lot of technology leaders doing incredible work in clean technology. There's the state has passed ambitious goals to transition to zero emissions, and so while the Washington stagnates, it's time for California leaders, elected leaders, and private sector leaders and nonprofits to take the lead, to lead, and to be international spokespeople, to go to COP39, to show what we're doing, so that the world realizes that America still has a lot of climate activists and innovators on climate.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we our budget situation in California is not is not great right now. So how do we ensure that remains prioritized even in sort of lean times in the state?
Well, I'm tempted to say this. I'll leave that for the people running for governor. But I think we need both sensible tax policy. I mean, you should be able to tax some of the extraordinary wealth so that we can invest in education, so we can invest in climate, so we can invest in our communities. We're producing enormous wealth in districts like mine, and I'm proud of the people doing it. But we also need to be able to invest into our state, so that we aren't the 40th in education and can make progress. And then we need to look at our programs and see, okay, how can they be the most effective? How can we use technology and AI to make sure that we're getting rid of unnecessary costs, and that we have competitive bidding for vendors, and that we don't have waste? But that's the task of a governor, and there are going to be, I'm sure, a lot of great candidates running, and I'm really focused on what I can do from my vantage point with the federal government.
All right. So let's close on. We can have time for one more question if folks have any more questions. But let's end on a note of optimism. What are you optimistic about over the next couple of years?
Well, America is making progress in spite of ourselves. I'm the son of Indian immigrants. My grandfather spent 4 years in jail alongside Gandhi, fighting for India's independence movement. And I was born in 1976 in Philadelphia, in our bicentenary. If you had told me in the 1980s, when I was growing up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, that we would have an African American, Indian American woman be the nominee of the Democratic Party, I would have told you you're out of your mind. And then if you had asked me how much percent is she going to get in Pennsylvania, I would have said probably 30%. But the reality is she got 48%. So we're 2% away. That's no reason to give up. That's no reason to be dejected. The work of building a multiracial democracy takes time, and it's not happening as fast as some of us would want. But I am really hopeful and confident, especially when I look at the new generations of Congress and the young people, that we will get there. And California is going to play a big role in us getting there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Congressman. We really appreciate your time. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Please check out The
Thank
Standard
you.
and subscribe.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.